Okay, so the sound quality seems to be on a rebound, and I hope that stays consistent. I think the situation before was that I had a number of videos that had been recorded and they were sort of waiting to be uploaded, so maybe it was just the file space was crowded or something like that. But anyway, for now it seems to be okay, so yeah. The subject I want to talk about here is, let's get better light in there, is drugs, recreational drugs. Um, I should emphasize recreational drugs because very often when we talk about drugs, we do overlook the fact that actually probably a very large portion of drugs as a noun is legal medicinal drugs, i.e. supplied by hospitals, doctors and so on, probably in the majority in fact. Even taking into account the massive trade in illegal drugs, it's probably still a majority that is medicinal drugs. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to say recreational or illegal drugs. Um, I guess I should be honest and talk about my own experience with this, just so people can, I suppose, understand the context that I'm coming from. I would be a liar if I said I've never done illegal drugs. There was a time in high school I dabbled in marijuana, dope, cannabis. Honestly, it didn't really have an effect on me in the sense that I didn't see what the big deal was. Now, whether I was inhaling it wrong or whatever, I don't know, or whether it was just the product was rubbish. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't see what the big deal was. I'd always had this interpretation of 60s hippies, kind of 1960s hippies, smoking spliffs and being all dazed out and stuff. I just didn't get that. I felt slightly relaxed, but I don't know. I just didn't feel it. It could have been the circumstances because a guy in my class gave it to us sort of in behind a railway station, I believe, so maybe it wasn't the right environment. I don't know. Other than that, the only drugs I've had really is alcohol and tobacco. I suppose if you count caffeine as a drug, but virtually zilch. In terms of more risky, edgy drugs, yeah, I've virtually no experience. So some people may look at this video and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about because you've never done it. But a large part of the argument I'm going to make is precisely relating to that. Um, I'm just going to come out and say it now. I really think that the vast majority of illegal drugs are shit. All they do is fuck up people's lives and cause problems in the world. And I would never present myself as some sort of expert on the subject. And I'm not speaking as an expert. I'm speaking as a citizen who has an opinion. Um, I'll be quite honest, I've never quite understood why someone would voluntarily put a chemical into themselves. And it's true that, you smoke too much, you can get cancer. You drink too much, you'll get liver disease, or there'll be the side effects of being drunk, or you'll become an alcoholic. But I think with alcohol and tobacco, it's very straightforward what happens. I think what scares me about, and I don't mind using that word, what scares me about certain recreational drugs is the unpredictability of them, is the impact they can have on controlling your mind. Now, to some extent, this also applies to alcohol because, raging drunks aren't in control of their own actions. But again, it's still predictable. You know that if you get blindingly drunk, you're either going to get violent or make an ass out of yourself. I think with recreational drugs, it brings you to a completely different plane of existence. And I'm saying that based on interviews I've seen, based on testimonies of people who have had serious trips. And obviously, the difficulty about this is there is no standard because no two people have exactly the same, exactly the same trip. But ultimately, no one can convince me that putting chemicals into your body is in any way a good thing, unless it is, to control if it's insulin or something like that if you're diabetic. But to put mind altering drugs into your system now, We tend to associate this from sort of the 1960s onwards. Of course, drugs have always been around in some way, going back to classical civilization. It's well known that Victorian writers used certain hallucinogenics, but I think drugs became kind of exploded onto the popular culture scene in the 60s. And in the early days, it was comparatively not so dangerous drugs like marijuana and so on. But I think the film Blow, um, really, with Johnny Depp, really shows how the drug trade kind of progressed from being relatively innocent to getting into quite heavy stuff by the 70s. And then, of course, by the early 90s, if we look at the history of this, there was a crack epidemic, which in no small part led to the situation in New York City when I believe 1990 was a murder peak for New York City. Over 2,000 homicides that year, and a large number of them were linked to the crack epidemic that was coming at that time from Central America and Colombia. Nowadays, it would more likely be Mexico. Um, so that is the history of the drug trade, I guess, summed up. It's a very, very brief history, but that would be it summed up. When I look around the world, countries where where drugs are a big part of the equation, Afghanistan, Mexico, the Philippines, there's almost always bloody conflict. Now, will be people who say that if the war on drugs only hurts those who are at the bottom of the chain, i.e., poor farmers who are producing this stuff to make their livelihood. And I definitely think there is a time when there needs to be a big review of the war on drugs in its various formats, going back from Richard Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs, um, which has been used by pretty much every US administration since. But in more recent years, there has been a bit of a re-evaluation of this. The most recent high-profile figure to speak out is Juan Manuel Santos, president of Colombia. Um, of course, his country has been directly in the front lines of this. He has just won the Nobel Peace Prize for securing peace in his country. Major achievement, I might add. But yeah, I don't want to get into all the ins and outs of this, and perhaps I don't want to veer too much into the politics of it, but it's inevitable that politics does come into it. One issue I've always had, and I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want people to get the wrong idea and think I'm totally lacking in empathy, or perhaps compassion is a better word. I can't say empathy because I haven't understood what it's like to be an addict, but compassion. Um, One thing I've never understood is that this idea that if you take an illegal substance, then somehow there's no responsibility involved. It's an issue that I've always had within the drug debate because whenever the issue of drug addiction is discussed now, it's a terrible situation for anyone to be in. I can see that. You don't have to be an addict to see that. But a problem I've always had within this debate is that, firstly, I do have difficulty, and I will admit this, I have difficulty with parallels with people who say have been involved in a horrible accident or who are homeless or any number of other things. The difference is that, okay, perhaps with homelessness, sometimes it's down to people making bad life choices. But with drug addiction, there is that starting point where someone chooses to take a dangerous illegal substance. Now, you can argue about the rights and wrongs of legalities. You could say, oh, it should all be made legal and that would solve problems. Maybe it would. But for the time being, if a substance is illegal, it is illegal for a reason. Because the government has determined that it is too dangerous to be seen as something that should be okay, allowed. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it is illegal for a reason. The government don't just wake up. Legislators don't just wake up and say, oh, let's just annoy drug addicts and make this illegal. There has been exhaustive committees into these things, debates, discussions. Um, and I think that when we talk about drugs, responsibility is often left out of it. I'm sorry, but in the end of the day, if you voluntarily take a dangerous illegal substance, you are partly to blame. So in that sense, I reject the victimhood narrative to some extent. I say to some extent, I'm not completely heartless. Addiction is a horrible thing, and I have compassion for people who are trying to deal with it. And I certainly don't think that an addict should be jailed simply for being an addict. If they have committed violent crime to get the drugs, then yeah, I've no sympathy with them. And that's a problem I think that's missing in the drug debate is responsibility. People say, well, if you legalize all drugs, then it won't go into the hands of dealers, and that will solve the problem. I think it's a massive gamble. There's no guarantee of that. I do understand the argument, and it's the same argument that's made about other social problems like prostitution and so on. Certainly, in countries where it has been done, I believe Portugal is one example. It's been somewhat successful. Because Portugal, unless I'm mistaken, has relatively low drug-related crime offences, violent crime offences. Um, but just because it works in one country doesn't mean it'll work in another. The other problem with absolute legalization of all drugs, and this is something that needs to be seriously looked at by both sides of the argument. The government is spending a lot of resources on firstly dealing with the effects of alcohol addiction and the various problems brought about by excess smoking. They've spent a lot of money on advertising on cigarette packaging. So, but actually, the government's policy has been quite successful in this. It has significantly reduced the number of deaths from smoking related diseases. So, I would say overall that's been a successful policy. But the point is, if you legalize all drugs, then presumably it's going to be just starting from the beginning again. Then the government is going to be spending money on, like, say, for example, I don't know, you get heroin legally, then the government's going to have to put advertising on it. This is a dangerous substance that will kill you. It's legal, but it's a dangerous substance. It can kill you. So to me, that part of the debate needs to be looked at. It seems to be you'd just be starting from the beginning again. So I suppose the argument of those who don't advocate universal legalization is why legalize something only to use resources to tell people not to use it. On the other hand, it takes up a lot of police resources and obviously has a huge impact on society being illegal because then people commit crime in order to get the substances. But there's no guarantee that if it was legal, they still wouldn't, say, I mean, presumably it's still going to be expensive. So what's to say they can't afford it? They resort to violent crime to steal it. Um, there's a lot of things that need to be considered with this. But basically, I'm sympathetic to addicts insofar as I believe they need help. I believe they need compassion for what they're going through. And, I don't want to look at this from an overly judgmental perspective. Everyone makes mistakes in life. But I do think that responsibility has to be part of it. You know, if someone has a horrible accident, that really is not their fault. Or if they're a victim of a violent crime and they become scarred or something. So when people talk about addicts as being victims in the same sense, or let's say a debilitating disease, it's totally different because the addict has made the choice to take the drugs. I'm obviously not talking about situations where they've been spiked or they've been coerced into it or led onto it. But when someone makes a choice to take a drug for whatever reason, maybe it's because they think it would be cool. Maybe it's because they think it would help them to overcome a difficult time in life. Whatever the reason is, in the end of the day, if they're an adult, there is responsibility. Put it this way, if I'm really depressed, if I'm angry, if I feel let down, I might decide to go on an alcohol binge. I'm not saying to do that today, but I did a bit in the past. And my rationale behind it would be, okay, well, that will temporarily get me to forget my problems. And it did temporarily work. But I had to then, therefore, be responsible for waking up with a terrible hangover the next day, or for spending more money than was, good for me. So, all I would say with the whole drug issue is, yeah, addicts need sympathy, and there needs to be understanding that addiction is not like it shouldn't just simply be classed as a crime. But at the same time, if you have made that initial choice to break the law, by the way, by taking an illegal substance, why does no one look at that? So that's why my sympathy only goes so far, because in the end of the day, you have chosen to break the law. Now, if we're going to be a utilitarian society, then everyone has responsibility. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. And I'm not coming from a point of view as some sort of religious moralizer. I'm not squeaky clean, like I've said. But I do believe in responsibility, and it's just common sense. Drugs are not good. So, what irritates me about the other side of the argument, that is those who advocate total legalization, they they seem to be they don't take any sort of acknowledgement that drugs are not a good thing. For them, it's like, oh, the war on drugs is terrible, and they point to all the reasons why, and they make legitimate points. But in that discourse, they forget that actually, whether they're legal or illegal, drugs are not a good thing, and they should not be encouraged. So I would say, even if they are legalized, in no way should they be encouraged. And certain politicians who do push for legalization, I notice are also very careful not to give the impression that they are pro drugs. If I was an elected official and I went down, this is something I'm still deciding on, but if I was an elected official and I went down the path of legalization, I would be very careful to say, well, look, I believe this will solve some problems, but that does not mean I believe drugs are a good thing. So everything needs to be looked at. Okay, I'm just aware of the time. We'll round this up. But in the end of the day, no one is going to convince me that recreational drug use is in any way a good thing. Um, I had a heated debate a while back with a guy from the Netherlands, surprise, surprise, and he tried telling me I was ignorant because I didn't know the wonderful things that drugs do. Drugs take over your mind, and I, I don't give a rat's ass what you say to advocate how good it might be. I don't care how good a trip will be, because to me, the danger is then the flip side, the negative trip. I watched a documentary yesterday about, I think I mentioned this before, Sid Vicious, and then another one about Keith Moon. Both obviously were well known as for their reckless lifestyles. In the case of Sid Vicious, it was somewhat, in his case, according to the documentary, Nancy Spungen got him onto the drugs. I've watched another interview today with Pete Doherty, the musician, and it's tragic to see what these chemicals do to people. This is common sense. It isn't about moralizing. It's just common bloody sense. Just don't do drugs, kids. Drugs are bad. But seriously, the amount of problems these cause. It is right that governments think very, very carefully before passing any legislation. And all I would say to those who are calling for universal legalization, and I'm not saying I'm against it, by the way, it's something I would consider. All I'm saying is you have to remember that whether they're legal or illegal in any circumstances, it's fucked up. They are not good for society, and there should never be a situation where it is advocated that they are good, because they're not. The only exception I would make is where there is a genuine medical purpose. Like, say, for instance, there is an argument that marijuana can help ease pain for arthritis sufferers. So things like that I'm totally understanding of. But no one is ever going to convince me that heroin is good for you. Um, so yeah, let me know your thoughts. This has been a longer video, a bit longer than I intended, but in the end of the day, the amount of problems drugs cause, no one will convince me that there's anything good about them. I think they're evil, frankly, a social evil. I hate drugs, and that's not coming from a moralizing, look down perspective. It's just a common sense perspective. As for addiction, I do believe that it shouldn't be treated in the same way as normal crime. But the exception to that is if someone has committed violent crime or they stole from someone to feed their addiction, I don't agree they're a victim. They've made the choice to do that. They made the choice to take the illegal drugs in the first place. So, yeah, let me know your thoughts.